My name is Trent Roberts. I'm an associate professor and soil fertility extension specialist with the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. Today I'm here at the Pine Tree Research Station in our long-term potassium or potash fertilization plots that have been in this same location and in rotation with soybean for over 20 years. The unique thing about this particular study is it allows us to track the influence of fertilization over a long time period, as well as gain a lot of information on how those long-term fertilization practices influence things like soil test K and crop response. Part of the reason I chose this location to talk at today is we're doing something unique this year and last year, and will continue for the next couple years into the future, is looking at several different interactions. The most important one being the impact of cultivar or variety selection on nutrient uptake and ultimately response to fertilization. So I'm standing in the middle of a zero check plot, and essentially what we're saying is this particular area has not received potassium fertilization for over 20 years. This particular cultivar that I'm standing in between right now is Diamond, Pure Line cultivar. And then over to my left, we have a hybrid cultivar that is also in an unfertilized check. And then over to my right, we have that same hybrid cultivar that is at an annual K rate of 160 pounds of K2O per acre. So some of the things that you can notice just off of your first impression is there are differences in height, color, and biomass, not only within a K rate, but across the different K rates. And so part of what we're investigating here is that responsiveness of the different cultivars to the fertilization rates as well as the soil test K levels. In previous research, particularly with nitrogen, Rick Norman and others found that there were significant differences, not necessarily in the fertilizer uptake of hybrids and pure line cultivars, but in the native soil nitrogen. And what that indicates to us is differences in root system or morphology within the hybrid cultivars that allow them to access either a greater volume of soil or be more efficient at uptaking those nutrients once they're accessed. So when we look at this, it's hard to imagine that these plots that I'm standing in haven't been fertilized with potash for more than 20 years. Just to the naked eye, you wouldn't necessarily say, those look overwhelmingly deficient in K or potash. Here in a minute, we'll come out here in the field and I'll show you, but on closer inspection, you can actually see those traditional potash deficiency symptoms when you get up close. But, just standing back, you wouldn't necessarily see that. And so one of the things that I want to cover and have you think about are when and how we can use tissue testing. And so there are really two different approaches. We can have a reactive approach or we can have a proactive approach to using tissue testing. And so traditionally in the past, we've relied on a reactive approach. And by that I mean we wait until we see some type of visual symptomology. It can be a nutrient deficiency symptom, or it can be some other appearance of the rice crop that just doesn't look normal or doesn't look correct. And we go in and we take tissue samples and we submit them for nutrient analysis to try and determine if that visual symptom is actually associated with a nutrient deficiency and what corrective measures might be taken. So traditionally we're using a reactive type of approach when we implement tissue testing. Some of the work that Dr. Slayton and our group has done over the past few years is look at ways to be more proactive with tissue testing. And one thing that we've done, similar to the work in soybeans, is developed critical concentrations throughout the reproductive growth stages of rice that allow us to determine whether or not potash or potassium is sufficient in the rice plant and whether or not we'll benefit from in-season applications of potash. So what we're doing is we're implementing a tool that allows us to be proactive. And one thing that we're trying to capture here and prevent is yield loss associated with hidden hunger. And so hidden hunger is defined as, nutrient concentrations within the plant that are below sufficient levels, but we don't necessarily see those traditional nutrient deficiency symptoms. And so the case for hidden hunger is really you're slowly starving the plant, or it's suffering from malnutrition, but it hasn't shown you that visual, hunger yet, or that deficiency symptom. And so there's a possibility that in some of our rice production systems, especially our silt loam or our lighter texture soils that have low soil test K, that we could be suffering from this hidden hunger type of issue and losing rice yield. And so what we're trying to do with this proactive, tissue sampling approach is try to identify those fields in season and make corrective applications so that we're not losing rice yield because of that hidden hunger. Now, how do we implement this? Well, tissue sampling is going to be influenced not only by the crop of interest, but also the growth stage. So when we're looking at potash or potassium in rice in particular, we're typically going to see those deficiency symptoms, sometime after we flood, and usually after green ring or panicle initiation, so about 3 to 4 weeks post-flood. What we're seeing is, a huge or dramatic increase in rice biomass that leads to a deficiency in potash when those soil test values are not high enough. And so, typically it's that 3 to 4 week time frame post-flood when we start to see potash deficiency symptoms. So really during that, beginning of reproductive growth. And so during that time, what we encourage producers to look at is sampling the Y leaf for tissue analysis. And so for those of you that have worked with rice, that Y leaf refers to the uppermost collared leaf on the plant. And so when you're looking at the plant closely, you can usually identify the newest leaf because it will be sticking, straight up out of the whorl of the rice plant. And then the Y leaf, or that uppermost collared leaf, is going to be kind of off to the side of that newest leaf. And the main thing is we're looking for the uppermost collared leaf, the Y leaf, and usually you get this type of offset nature, which makes it a little bit easier to find or identify. What we want people to do anytime they're tissue testing is remember that for nutrient analysis, we're always going to dry and grind these samples before processing. And so when you take these samples in the field, we want you to put them in some type of paper bag and put them in the dash of your pickup, or try to get that drying process started as quickly as we can. When we're looking at nutrient analysis, we don't ever want you to put those samples into plastic bags, right? We want them in paper sacks so that they'll start drying as quickly as possible. The last thing that I want to hit on real quick is some of the issues that we've been seeing this past season in rice that have been really hard to diagnose, really hard to explain. So in several instances with our spring planting conditions, we had relatively wet soils for an extended period of time following planting. That led to issues with rooting depth. Another issue that we've encountered in a couple of different places is tillage that was performed either in the fall, winter, or spring when the ground was too wet to really be worked, and led to a significant amount of compaction in those fields. And so that increased compaction or that lack of rooting has sometimes led to significant, visual symptomology of nutrient deficiency, even though there were adequate soil test values present or fertilizers were applied. And so that's just a reminder that, restricted root growth of any kind can limit nutrient uptake. And then we've also seen other cases where, compaction wasn't necessarily an issue, where the rice plant seemed to be doing well, but it just didn't have, a normal type of appearance. And so that's more of a diagnostic or a reactive type of approach, where we're going to go out and take samples, one, to determine whether or not it's a nutrient related issue, and then two, if it's not a nutrient related issue, to kind of cross that off the list and look at pathology, entomology, or physiology as another potential reason for maybe why that rice isn't growing or appearing like we would expect it to. So there are a lot of different things that we can do and be useful. You know, the one thing that I would say is tissue sampling can be very useful. We do have some fairly well-defined guidelines for our sufficiency levels, but when we're implementing tissue testing, you know, please remember that the crop we're looking at and the growth stage are very important to identify the correct plant part that needs to be sampled in order to interpret that tissue analysis correctly. So what I want to leave you with today is basically, you know, there are a lot of tools out there to manage nutrients effectively in rice. And I just want to remind you that these can help you a lot, not only in maximizing your yield, but maximizing your profitability. So as always, the Instar program and the Green Seeker are great for nitrogen management in rice. When we start looking at potash, you know, we have excellent soil tests to predict potassium fertilizer rates. We have the economic potash rate calculator, which based on rice value and potash fertilizer prices associated with the soil test K level, can give us our most economical potash rate. We have in-season tissue samples that we can be implemented for potash determination in season to see whether or not it's adequate. And so there are just a lot of tools out there at your disposal as a rice producer to help ensure that fertility is not limiting your rice production system. As always, we thank you for joining the Rice Online Field Day. If you ever have any questions related to nutrient management in crops, feel free to reach out. Thanks.